Have you ever heard about the most wicked kings in the Bible? Some of them took their kingdoms to levels of evil and corruption that are almost unimaginable. From idolatry and human sacrifices to dark alliances, these kings directly defied God's commands. But the worst part? One of these kings did something so horrific that it's still remembered as the greatest shock in biblical history. Are you ready to find out who it was and what he did? Stay with me until the end of this video to discover how the choices of these kings impacted all of Israel's history, and how their decisions still offer lessons for us today. Jeroboam began his journey as a servant of Solomon, but his hunger for power led him to rebellion, which ultimately divided the kingdom of Israel. When he became king of the northern tribes, Jeroboam feared that his people would return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple and reconcile with the kingdom of Judah. So he made a catastrophic decision. He built 2 golden calves and proclaimed them as the new gods of Israel. This introduction of idolatry didn't just turn the people away from God. It set Israel on a path of disobedience and sin that would mark the northern kingdom for generations. The consequences of this choice were devastating. Jeroboam not only broke his covenant with God by introducing idols, but also established a false system of worship that led the people to abandon the sacred scriptures. His reign was marked by continuous efforts to consolidate his power through political alliances and control over the people's spirituality. However, this decision ultimately became his downfall. Jeroboam died tragically, and his lineage was wiped out, just as prophesied by Ahijah, the prophet who had initially foretold that he would become king. The kingdom Jeroboam built fell apart quickly after his death, without the protection of God. Now, if Jeroboam opened the door to idolatry, what came after? Who continued down this path of sin and idolatry, taking the people even further away from God? One of the most influential kings was Ahab, but what made him even more dangerous was his alliance with a powerful woman, Jezebel. Stick around because the story of Ahab and Jezebel is one of the darkest in the Bible, and you'll understand how they nearly destroyed Israel completely. Ahab was one of the most wicked kings of Israel, infamous for his disastrous alliance with Jezebel, a Phoenician princess devoted to Baal. Under her influence, Ahab not only allowed but encouraged the worship of this pagan god, leading the entire kingdom away from God and the sacred scriptures. Jezebel went even further. She didn't stop at promoting idolatry. She began a relentless persecution of God's prophets, aiming to wipe out the worship of the Lord entirely. The spiritual corruption spread across Israel with devastating consequences. Jezebel's influence over Ahab was so great that Israel became a stronghold of Baal worship. Ahab built temples, altars, and shrines for Baal, promoting immoral practices and pagan sacrifices. Yet the prophet Elijah, with unshakable faith and courage, confronted Ahab and Jezebel's power, culminating in the showdown at Mount Carmel, where the God of Israel proved to be the one true God, defeating the false prophets of Baal. Despite this, Ahab and Jezebel remained deeply immersed in sin, refusing to abandon their idolatry and challenging God's warnings. Ahab's end was as tragic as his sinful life. In an attempt to escape the prophesied judgment, Ahab disguised himself in battle, believing he could outsmart God. But a random archer fired an arrow, and it fatally struck Ahab. His body was returned to Samaria, where, as his chariot was washed, dogs licked his blood, fulfilling Elijah's prophecy that the king would pay for his sins in a disgraceful manner. Jezebel met a similar end, being thrown from a window and devoured by dogs. The end of these rulers was a clear sign that God would not allow corruption and idolatry to go unpunished. If you want to learn more about how Elijah, with his unwavering faith, transformed his life and fought against this darkness, I highly recommend watching the video about his story here on this channel. And to better understand how Baal became such a devastating force in Israel's history, we've got another video on the channel you need to check out, which dives deeper into this major enemy of the Israelites frequently mentioned in the Bible. These videos will give you a deeper insight into the spiritual battles Israel faced and how men of God like Elijah sought to restore faith. But if you thought Ahab and Jezebel's reign was terrible, get ready to meet the next king. Manasseh went beyond any imaginable limit. He did something so horrific that it's hard to believe a king could do such a thing. Stay tuned, because in the next topic we'll uncover one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. Manasseh was the king who led Judah into unimaginable wickedness. When he took the throne, he didn't just bring back idolatry, he took it to extremes that God's people had never experienced before. Under his rule, pagan altars were erected throughout the kingdom, even inside God's sacred temple. The Bible records that Manasseh not only worshipped false gods, but also practiced witchcraft and consulted evil spirits, showing complete disregard for the sacred scriptures and the God of Israel. What was dark under previous kings became a true spiritual nightmare under Manasseh's reign. The most cruel and unimaginable act committed by Manasseh was the sacrifice of his own son. Yes, he offered his son as a burnt offering to pagan gods, burning him on the profane altars he had built. This act, a direct affront to God, symbolized Judah's complete departure from God's laws. Manasseh's wickedness shocked even those who had grown used to idolatry. The innocent blood shed by the king in the Valley of Hinnom represented the peak of corruption, a stain that would plague the kingdom for generations. Imagine the pain and outrage felt by the few faithful who still tried to follow God's ways. Manasseh, however, did not escape punishment. The Lord brought severe judgment upon him. He was captured by the Assyrians, bound with hooks and bronze chains, and taken to Babylon as a prisoner. At the height of his humiliation, something unexpected happened. Manasseh repented. In his desperation, he turned to God, asking for mercy, and to everyone's surprise, God heard his prayer. Manasseh was freed and returned to Jerusalem, where he tried to restore what he had destroyed in the final years of his life. He removed the pagan idols and attempted to redirect Judah to the worship of the true God. However, the scars of his sins were deep, and the consequences of his wickedness echoed for generations. Manasseh's story is a powerful lesson of repentance and mercy, but also a reminder that a life full of sin can come at a great cost. Despite his repentance, Judah was never the same, and the seeds of destruction he planted continued to grow. But if you thought Manasseh's story was the peak of evil in Judah, get ready to meet Ahaz, a king who defied God in a different, yet equally devastating way. Ahaz was a king who made devastating decisions for Judah, choosing to trust Assyria rather than seeking God's help. Faced with threats of invasion, he offered tribute of gold and silver taken from God's temple in exchange for protection. His alliance with Assyria didn't bring peace but placed Judah under the control of a foreign power. Ahaz's choice weakened the kingdom spiritually and politically, leading the people further away from God. Beyond compromising Judah's independence, Ahaz also introduced pagan practices into the Jerusalem temple. Fascinated by the altars he saw in Assyria, he replicated these rituals, defiling the sacred place with pagan sacrifices. His actions not only corrupted the temple, but also encouraged sin and idolatry among the people. The result was a deep spiritual rupture, where the worship of God was replaced by foreign practices. Ahaz's end was tragic, revealing his failure as a leader. He died despised by his own people and wasn't even buried in the tombs of Israel's kings, a final disgrace for a king who abandoned God's path. His reign left Judah vulnerable, weakened spiritually and politically, and the consequences of his decisions resonated for generations. Ahaz's legacy serves as a bitter reminder of the consequences of trusting in human alliances rather than in the power of God. Now that you know the story of the most wicked kings in the Bible, it's time to reflect. What choices are we making that might be pulling us away from God? What can we learn from these dark examples about the impact of our decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments. And to keep diving into the mysteries of the Bible, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Oh, and before you go, you can't miss our video about the fall of the angel Lucifer and how he became Satan. This story will reveal secrets you never imagined. Feeling curious? Then click and watch now.